This study, I hope we have time. I hope I don't talk too much on this, but there's a challenge, and if we don't get to this, I want you to ask a question, maybe among yourselves later. How is what we're going to talk about right now related to Judges? Okay. But when you come to the Psalm, there's what I call an existential interpretive question, and that is, who is the I in the Psalms? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Is that the existential? Should I read that as, well, just swap my name for the I, and kind of, I'm able to read these as directly I'm the person speaking? Or am I to see David as the one speaking? Or am I to go all the way with Luther and say every person who speaks in Scripture is Jesus? Or is it David speaking for Jesus? So there's this huge debate. Who's speaking? And secondly, is there an organization to the Psalter? Like there are 150 Psalms. Is there any rhyme or reason to how they're presented? So that's what we're going to look at as we look at Psalm 1 and 2 in context. And I don't know if you've ever noticed this in your Bible, but do you notice how at Psalm 1 it says Book 1 of the Psalter? Have you ever wondered what that was about? Why that's there? Well, it turns out there are 5 books in the Psalter. I don't know if you knew that. Book 1, 1 to 41. Book 2, 42 to 72. My mnemonic device is 41, 1, 42, 72, 2. That's kind of how I start to remember which ones end. Book 3, 73, 89. I've just got to memorize that. 90, 106, 4. And then book 5, 107 to 150. And those 150 Psalms are called the Psalter. So you call the whole thing the Psalter. And they're written over at least a period of 1,000 years. So the oldest Psalm is actually Psalm 90, which is called a prayer of Moses, which is really interesting because in Psalm 90 he says the length of a man's life is 70 years or 80 if he has strength. And I don't know if you know the story of Moses well enough. Everything that Moses does for God happens after he's 80 years old, 80 to 120. So it's like if his life were a soccer game, every significant thing he does in penalty time at the end, added. And so he wrote Psalm 90 and said that. Books 1 and 2 are called the prayers of David, meaning that these are the prayers he said out loud to God. What's interesting about that is Psalm 72, it says is by Solomon, but if it says these are the prayers of David, he's actually using his son's poem as one of his prayers. So it's kind of interesting. At least 2 of them are prayer books. Psalm 137, which is in book 5, mentions the exile in Babylon, and so that's after 586. So if Moses wrote, let's say, 1400, and the exile 586, that's almost 1,000 years putting together the Psalter. There are other 5s in the Bible, so there are 5 books of the Pentateuch. Some have suggested that perhaps book 1 is like Genesis, book 2 is like Exodus, book 3 is like Leviticus. I've never been able to make it work like that, but that's a possibility. There are also, at least in the Hebrew Bible, 5 scrolls that are read on specific days. Song of Songs is read on the eve of Passover. Ruth is read, I forget the major festivals. Lamentations read, Pentecost. Ruth is read on Pentecost. Lamentations read on the 9th of Ab. The when the temple was destroyed. Ecclesiastes is read in tabernacles, and Esther is read during the Feast of Purim. So it could be that maybe the 5 books are maybe somehow connected with feast. And in the New Testament, I don't know if you know this, but Matthew is divided into 5 sections. When Jesus finished these, when Jesus finished these. And so it may be that Matthew is trying to mimic the Pentateuch, or maybe mimic the Psalter, or maybe both those things. But there are 5s in the Bible, and so it could be the 5 have to do with that. It's clear that at least Psalm 1 is probably the preface of the first 2 books. 1 and 2 are the only ones that don't have by, somebody in the start of it. So it could be a preface. We don't know if David put it there or if it was put later. The Psalms of Ascent, Psalm 120 to 134 are 15 Psalms. They're recited on Passover, and the Mishnah actually talks about how far they got in reciting the Psalms during the Passover. The biggest Passover, what that's interesting is, the theory is there are 15 steps to the temple, and they sang one on each step. If they're sung, as the Mishnah says, on Passover, then Jesus, when he was on the cross, would be hearing. If they sang loud enough, would be hearing as they took each step up to the temple. The last 5 are Hallelujah Psalms, so maybe that's like the appendix. And those 5 all start Hallelujah, let us praise Yahweh. So there's obviously some kind of organization. It's clear it's not chronological because the oldest one is Psalm 90. There are repeated psalms. So Psalm 14 is the same exact psalm as Psalm 53, except instead of Elohim, it's Yahweh. So there's a slight difference, but repeated. Same thing's true of Psalm 40 and Psalm 70, Psalm 57 and 108, and Psalm 60. All the same. So different ones of these psalters have repeated sections. In the New Testament, it's interesting how many of these are applied to Jesus. Psalm 110 is the most quoted psalm, and it's 25 or 30 times it's applied to Jesus. Psalm 22 is quoted by Jesus on the cross. Psalm 31, I believe, is into your hands I commend my spirit. So if you put all the accounts together, Jesus said 7 words on the cross. Psalm 31 is the last one. Psalm 2 is part of the first sermon in Acts 2. Psalm 45, thy throne, O God, is forever and ever. Hebrews says that's God the Father talking about Jesus. Oddly enough, Psalm 91 is quoted by the devil, who assumes that the person Psalm 91 is written about is Jesus. So it's like even the devil has a Christocentric approach to the Psalms. And Psalm 6, and you just start going through how many are applied, and like this is a partial list. It could have twice that many. It just seems like every book of all 5 books and sections from all 5 books are applied to Jesus. This is the most quoted one. The Lord said to my Lord. In Hebrew, you would read that out loud. Adonai said to Adoni. And so you're kind of wondering, okay, well, what's there? Sit in my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. And if we're reading this in light of Judges, you say, oh my goodness, this is the violence language again. And maybe that is, but they do call something else a footstool in the Old Testament. The temple is called a footstool, and you could read it that even the enemies are not being subjected, but rather turned into the temple. Psalm 102 is really interesting in that the writer of Hebrews applies it to Jesus, but Psalm 102 is about Yahweh. And the writer of Hebrews is saying, Jesus is the you. You of old laid the foundations of the earth. The heavens are the works of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will wear out like a garment. You will change them like a robe. They will pass away, but you are the same, and your years have no end. Psalm 40, again quoted in Hebrews, sacrifice and offering you have not delighted, but you have given me an open ear. Interesting, the Septuagint translates that a body you have prepared for me. Burnt offering and sin offering you have not required. Then I said, behold, I have come. In the scroll of the book it's written of me, I delight to do your will, O God. Your law is within my heart. If you're kind of keeping track, this is the end of book 1. So the end of book 1 is mentioning someone mentioned in the beginning of book 1. And that you, O Lord, belong steadfast love, for you render to a man according to his work. That's really weird because Psalm 18, written by David, Psalm 18 says, you have rewarded me according to the righteousness of my hands. You think, okay, is that before or after I murdered Uriah and took his wife, molested his wife? You've rewarded me according to the righteousness of my hands. And you say, oh, well, he wrote that before. Okay, he wrote it before. Let's say he wrote it before. Why does he quote it at the end of 2 Samuel the day before he died? Didn't he know that his hands were covered in blood? I mean, how is it that he's able to say, you've rewarded me according to the righteousness of my hands, when my hands are guilty? And it brings that existential tension again. It's like, okay, is he speaking of himself as David, or is he speaking of himself as future David, or is he like having spiritual Alzheimer's where like he's just put that out of his mind? And like, how does that work? How can a person who's murdered another human being say, you've rewarded me according to the righteousness of my hands? Well, Psalm 1 and maybe 1 and 2 functions as a preface, and is going to give us a little insight into that. Psalm 1 and 2 function as an introduction to the whole Psalter. Psalm 1:1 in Hebrew begins with the word ashereh, translated, oh, the blessings of the man. And Psalm 2:12 ends with ashereh. So in Hebrew poetry, that's called an inclusio, where you start and end with the same thing. And it's like read everything in the middle together. So who's the king and who's the son? And then in English, there's something that goes on in the text that we have no ability to see, but that a Hebrew reader could see. And that is the phrase, kiss the son. The word the son is in a different language. So imagine you're reading it in English, and my German is not good enough to do this example, but imagine this is right. Imagine it said, kiss den Sohn, lest he be angry, and you perish in the way. If you heard that, would you not ask the question, why in the world did he just put those two words in a different language? That happens in the Psalm. So it's Hebrew, 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 Aramaic, Hebrew, Hebrew, Hebrew. And if David wrote it, Hebrew was originally written in Paleo-Hebrew, and it looks radically different from Aramaic. So if you imagine you're reading that, and boom, it's like in another language. It's like, why is that in another language? And sorry?
What verse is that?
12:2-12, kiss the son.
Okay.
So in Hebrew, the word son is ben, like Benjamin. And the Aramaic word for son is bar, like bar mitzvah or bar neshah, the son of man. So it's actually the word bar there, not ben. So it's like doesn't use the Hebrew. It uses the Aramaic. And it's interesting, if you tried to read it in Hebrew, then instead of saying kiss the son, it would say kiss the pure one. And so you're kind of like, okay, what's going on? All those years ago when I was an undergraduate student at UGA, I had the privilege to take Hebrew, and my teacher was from Yale. He was very good. I think it was his first year teaching, and he taught me Hebrew. And the weird thing is, he went on to become the foremost expert on the editing of the Psalter. Anybody who ever writes on the Psalms quotes him. Gerald Wilson was his name. And he's this young guy. And the year I graduated, they had the faculty come sit with the 5,000 graduates, on Sanford Stadium on the football field, 40,000 people there, all the families. And odd thing, he came and found and sat beside me when I graduated, which is really weird. Why would a faculty person do that? He spent his life looking at how the Psalter was edited, and he rightly made massive contributions in the field. But when it comes to this verse, blessed are those who take refuge in him, Wilson would say, grammatically, the him there is the king. Blessed are those who take refuge in him. And when you read it in Hebrew, that's obviously what it says. But Wilson, who's like the foremost expert, says the text cannot mean that, because everywhere else in the Psalter you take refuge in God. Wilson died when he was 53, so he's been dead a while now. But since he died, people have noticed that in the 5 books of the Psalter, you have take refuge in man and the Davidic king, but by the end you have take refuge in God. And so the argument today is that the hoping in the Davidic king has been replaced with hoping in Yahweh. But I wonder if this is a preface to the whole thing, it's actually a merging of the king and Yahweh. That's the whole reason it's put there, and that's why in the end you have this theological thing that doesn't seem to make sense. We need a king, we need a king. No, we need Yahweh because kings are bad. We need a king, Yahweh, and what if the solution is Yahweh is the king? Yahweh is the Davidic king. I wish Dr. Wilson were still alive. I would love to ask him what he thought about that. And he really did help me as a student. He was a very patient teacher. Psalm 2 applied to Jesus. Psalm 2 applied to Jesus here. Psalm 2 applied to Jesus in Hebrews. Psalm 2 applied to Jesus here. The New Testament says Psalm 2 is about Jesus. Well, let's read Psalm 1 and 2 and let's see where this takes us. Blessed is a man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, or stand in the way of sinners, or sit in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord. And remember 40 talked about in the scroll of the book is written, I delight in your law. This is the verse that it's talking. On his law he meditates day and night. He is like a tree planted by the streams of water that yields its fruit in his season. Do you pick up the Eden references here that this is talking about the tree of life? Its leaf does not wither, in Hebrew, become foolish. Whatever he does prospers. Then it's contrasted, not so the wicked. The wicked are like chaff the wind drives away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, the way of the wicked will perish. So if you're preaching Psalm 1, it's, be the blessed man. Be like the blessed man. You'll be like the tree of life to other people. Then you read Psalm 2. And there's a problem in Psalm 2 in terms of the translation. Well, there's a problem in Psalm 1. ESV, blessed is the man who does not walk. But if you look at the Hebrew, another translation is, blessed is the man who did not walk in the counsel of the wicked. Is that a difference in translation to you? And notice that's how the Psalm Targum translates it. Blessed is the man who has not walked. That's how the Latin translates it. That's how the Septuagint translates it. So if instead of blessed is the man who does not walk, it said blessed is the man who has not walked, okay, now I'm toast because, I can promise to be good for God, but if you're asking me, have I been good to God? It's like, no. No, like I'm on the wicked side of that. And the wicked are like chaff, and they're not going to stand, and they're excluded. Well, okay, how am I like that? Well, notice there's an inclusio. Blessed is the man, blessed are those who take refuge in him. That's what it is in Hebrew, and you can see these are exactly the same words, right? Blessed, blessed. So it starts and ends the same way. They're meant to be read together. And so what's Psalm 2 about? Why do the nations rage? People plot in vain. The kings of the earth and rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. If we were reading this in Hebrew and I were just reading it aloud, you would hear, and his Messiah. Okay, well, is that David or is it the future David? Saying, let us burst their bonds, let us cast away their cords from us. He sits in the heavens, laughs, the Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, so this is God speaking, as for me, I have set my king. I thought God said he was only going to do princes. But God is saying, I'm going to set my king on Zion, my holy hill. And then the king speaks. I'll tell it the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I've begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, the ends of the earth your possession. You will break them with a rod of iron, dash them to pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore, O kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss din zone, lest he be angry, and you perish in the way. For his wrath, who is his? Din zone, is quickly kindled. Blessed are those who take refuge in him. Well, it shouldn't say that. It says, blessed are those who take refuge in God, but that's not what it says. Who is the king? Is it David? Did you read Psalm 3? Did you read the title to Psalm 3? What does the title to Psalm 3 say? This is the psalm David wrote when he fled from Absalom. When did he flee from Absalom? After he slept with Bathsheba and killed Uriah, and God was punishing his family, where Absalom, whose name means father of peace, killed Amnon because Amnon had slept with Tamar. David hadn't done anything about it because he had his own sexual baggage. And so civil war breaks out. Absalom tries to kill David. David leaves his concubine and says, you guys are on your own. These are the prayers of David. Was David, blessed is the man who does not. Blessed is the man who did not. I don't think there's any way you can read that of David. Tamar wouldn't have said, whatever he does prospers. Amnon wouldn't have said the kingdom wouldn't say whatever he does. This is talking about a different David. This is talking about the Messiah, his Messiah. And if taking refuge in the Messiah is so at odds with don't take refuge in men, take refuge in Yahweh, could it be that the Psalter is leading us to the place where we realize that Yahweh is going to be the Messiah? And that's exactly what happened in the story. I think that the preface is inviting us to read the Psalter in a Christocentric way. I don't know what to make of this. Well, I think I'll stop. I think I'll stop there. What do you find interesting about all of that?
On a sort of devotional level, I mean, Jesus quoting the Psalms is, you should probably read them. If they're good enough for the Son of God, then it's interesting to be invited to pray the words that Jesus would have prayed.
Yeah. Some people have argued that Jesus was quoting the Psalms. In two of the accounts, the only thing he says is Psalm 22. Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani. Why have you forsaken me? And then all seven, the last of the seven, into your hands I commend my spirit. That's Psalm 31. Some people argue that that's what he was doing on the cross. He's reading through or reciting the Psalms, which that's very telling, isn't it?
It's like so internalized that on the cross.
And while I have a huge problem with David saying, you've rewarded me according to the righteousness of my hands, I have no problem with Jesus earning for his bride saying according to the righteousness of my hands. What else do you find interesting?
So when I was reading it in my homework, I have a hard time understanding how some things in the Psalms seem to contradict each other. So like in 2:12, it says, for his anger flares up in an instant. But then later in 86:15, it says that God is slow to anger. And so what do you do with things like that? Where is he gets ticked off really easily, or is he waiting on it?
Or I've really wrestled with that question, and there's a whole debate, and Sam can speak more to it than me, but the whole, does God have emotions, right? That's a very technical argument, but the idea that God could look at a house full of people molesting children and not say, I'm going to kick the door down. God, however you think of that, God has that. Now it says he's slow to anger, so he's going to be as gracious as anybody and 1,000 times more, but is he angry at wickedness? Absolutely, he's angry at wickedness. But not in the way we are, where we're like gasoline fires and poof, and then all of a sudden it's like God's anger ours is the flawed version of that. God's is the normal version, and we were created to be in the image of God, and so if when we're fixed, we're not going to look at wickedness in the world and say we're going to be like the most righteous hero deliverer, and we're going to stop evil, and we're going to bring people good, and that's a good thing. That's a noble thing. A righteous king, but a king who will fight to set his people free. What else? There's an obvious question about the Son, kissed in zone. What is that obvious question? If you are reading a book and it goes into another language, why do they do that? So here's my answer. It's totally meaningless. It's like everything else we've seen in here. It's just one of the details. He needed it to be 2 million characters long. He was kind of bored that day, so he just threw. You guys are laughing at me. It's kind of hurt my feelings. Okay, it means something. Okay, what's the follow-up question? He did. Isn't part of the Bible written in Aramaic? 7 chapters. Do any of those 7 chapters mention a figure called the Bar Nishah, the Son of Man? A figure that when Jesus quotes the verse that mentions him, the high priest rips his clothes and says, blasphemy, because there's a figure who is coming to God, but who is treated like God and like that whole 2 powers in heaven thing. And Jesus just alludes to that verse. The high priest says, we've got to kill him. That's interesting that figure is called Bar. It's interesting that figure is imperfectly merging with the Ancient of Days. I think it's 7:14. I probably have that reference wrong, but Daniel 7:14. Could it be connected? Could it be a double entendre, kiss the pure one, lest he be angry? Is David the pure one? David's not the pure one when the next verse says, this is what I sang to God when I ran for my life from Absalom. Is it the pure one who is the Son? We know the psalmist knows how to spell son because in the previous verse he says, you are my son, Ben, right? He knows how to spell the word son in Hebrew. But when he says kiss the son, that's not the word he uses. He uses the Aramaic word. Why? If meaningless isn't the right answer, then what is the right answer? And how does the way you put Psalm 2 affect the way you read the rest of the Psalter? I think those are helpful things to wrestle with. And I wonder if Luther's answer, or at least leaning in Luther's direction, isn't right to, yes, read the Psalms as us pouring our heart out to God, but at the same time realize that in doing that, it means more than just even David pouring his heart out. It's somehow rising above that to be the very words of Jesus. All right. Well, that's what I have for you tonight, unless there are any other. All right. Well, we only have two times left